Welcome to Breast Cancer Breakthroughs. We think of breast cancer as just one disease, but really there are many different types of breast cancer, all with their own unique characteristics. HER2-positive breast cancer is one type of breast cancer that makes too much of the HER2 protein, which makes these cancer cells grow out of control. There are currently 8 HER2-targeted therapies that are FDA approved to treat metastatic HER2-positive breast cancer. But despite these numerous treatment options, many patients still experience treatment resistance, which leads to disease progression. If you'd like to learn more about treatment resistance, check out our video linked below. In today's episode of Breast Cancer Breakthroughs, we speak with Komen Scholar alumni Dr. Ian Kropp and Komen Scholar Dr. Sarah Tolaney, who discuss HER2-positive breast cancer, current treatment options, and some of the ongoing clinical trials that are looking to expand treatment options for patients. We also spoke with patient advocate Susan Cagle, who offers her unique perspective on this topic. But first, let's lay some groundwork with Dr. Kropp on background for HER2-positive breast cancer.
It's characterized by an alteration in the DNA that has caused a particular gene called HER2 to have multiple copies, and we call that amplification of the HER2 gene. And the HER2 gene is the blueprint for a protein called HER2. It's a normal protein. It sits on the surface of many different types of cells, and its job is to tell the cell to grow faster under conditions of stress. And normally there's maybe 1,000 copies of HER2 on each cell. But when these cells have this alteration, this amplification of the genes, you get too much of this HER2 protein on the surface of the cells. In fact, in a HER2-positive cancer, there can be 1 million or 2 million HER2 proteins on each cancer cell. Essentially, these cells are just covered with this HER2 protein. And as I mentioned, the job of HER2 is to tell the cell to grow faster. And these cancer cells grow more aggressively, more rapidly than some of the other breast cancer subtypes. And so that's what we saw in the clinic early on, was that a HER2-positive cancer tends to grow more aggressively.
If you want to learn more about HER2-positive breast cancer, check out the video we linked below. Next, Dr. Kropp spoke in more detail about how HER2 levels are tested, how HER2-positive breast cancer is diagnosed, and the available treatments for people following a diagnosis.
When patients have a biopsy of their cancer or they have surgery for their cancer, the pathologist can look under the microscope and do a test for how much HER2 protein there is on each cell. That's called IHC test, or immunohistochemistry. And you get a score of 0 to 3 plus, so 0, 1 plus, 2 plus, 3 plus, where the 3 pluses are the cancers that are expressing a very high amount of HER2 protein. That's a HER2-positive cancer. Or we can actually count how many genes, how much of looking at the DNA of the cancer, how many genes of HER2 there are. That's called a FISH test or a KISH test. And if the number of HER2 genes in each cancer is above a certain level, that's also a way to identify these HER2-positive cancers. So typically we do either one or the other of these tests, and that identifies which cancers are HER2-positive. And while we can do subsequent biopsies, in general, because this is an alteration that happens pretty early in the development of the cancer, once a cancer is positive, it tends to stay positive. And we also don't see a lot of cancers go from negative to positive, although that happens in probably 8 or 10% of cancers. So in general, this is something that stays fairly stable over time. Once the realization was that these cancers are driven by this HER2 protein, that's led to the development of a number of different drugs that all target this HER2 protein. In fact, we have 8 that are approved right now in the clinic, and we tend to use almost all of them at some time or another. We start out with that 3-drug combination of a chemotherapy plus these 2 antibodies, trastuzumab and pertuzumab, and that's highly effective. Most patients' cancer shrinks substantially with that combination, and we continue that for a certain amount of time, depending on how well they're working and how many side effects they're having. typically something like 6 or 8 cycles of therapy, somewhere around 4 to 6 months of therapy, but that can vary. But then once we feel like we've had maximal benefit from the 3 drugs with the chemotherapy, we typically actually stop the chemotherapy, and patients can just continue on those 2 very targeted drugs, the pertuzumab and trastuzumab, without chemotherapy. And that combination we call maintenance treatment can be very effective for many, many months or years in patients. And if a cancer develops resistance to that, which certainly can occur over time, we then switch to a second approach, and this is a different way of attacking HER2. It's the same general idea of using an antibody targeting HER2 with a chemotherapy, but this is a new approach where we actually combine the 2 drugs together. So there's something called an antibody drug conjugate, which is basically the HER2 antibody, which is what's very specific for HER2, and it's linked to the chemotherapy directly, so that rather than give 2 drugs separately, you're giving this one combination drug. It's a way to kind of specifically deliver the potent chemotherapy right to the cancer cell, with the hope that because the chemotherapy is attached to the antibody and not just floating around by itself, it won't damage normal tissues as much as when you give chemotherapy alone. The one that we typically use in this situation is called trastuzumab deruxtecan, also known as Enhertu, and that's been shown to be very effective, probably the most potent drug against HER2-positive breast cancer that we have right now, and that's used in patients whose cancer has progressed on that combination of antibodies and chemotherapy that we use first. And when used in that what we call second-line situation, the effectiveness has been on average well over 2 years, and it works in most patients. Eventually, though, cancers can develop resistance to trastuzumab deruxtecan, and at that point, we have a number of other options available. There's another antibody drug conjugate called T-DM1, which is also effective and has very few side effects. There's also a whole nother approach to targeting HER2, which is what's called a kinase inhibitor. It's a pill that actually blocks the HER2 function on the inside of the cell, and also can be very effective. And there's the one that's typically used is called tucatinib, and it's used in combination with trastuzumab and an oral chemotherapy called capecitabine, and that's also shown to be effective. And we have a number of other combinations available as well. So between those 8 drugs that I mentioned targeting HER2, we have a number of different options that we can use for patients with this particular subtype of breast cancer.
To learn more about the 8 FDA-approved treatments for HER2-positive breast cancer, you can check out our video linked in the description. Despite all of the progress that has been made, there is still no cure for metastatic HER2-positive breast cancer today. So we asked Dr. Kropp to discuss some of the latest efforts that researchers are making to further expand treatment options for patients with newly diagnosed metastatic HER2-positive breast cancer.
The standard has been for many years a combination of these 2 antibodies, trastuzumab and pertuzumab, along with a chemotherapy. Because of this new antibody drug conjugate called trastuzumab deruxtecan was so effective in patients whose cancer had already developed resistance to initial treatment, there was a study called DESTINY-Breast09 in which patients with newly diagnosed disease were randomized to either that combination of 2 antibodies and chemotherapy, or just getting this trastuzumab deruxtecan antibody drug conjugate in combination with the antibody pertuzumab. The patients who got the trastuzumab deruxtecan, also known as T-DXd, antibody drug conjugate, on average had their cancers controlled for almost 41 months, so well over 3 years, compared to about 2 years with the standard antibodies plus chemotherapy approach. And fortunately, both approaches worked well, and in fact, the response rate, meaning the percentage of patients whose cancer substantially shrunk, was very high in both arms. The other trial that was recently reported also was looking at patients with newly diagnosed disease, and they took a different approach to the trial I just mentioned. They were looking at patients who started on that standard treatment of 2 antibodies, trastuzumab, pertuzumab plus chemotherapy. Everybody got that, But then once patients got to the point where you're stopping the chemotherapy and just doing the antibodies, this so-called maintenance phase, they looked at specifically the patients whose cancers was not only HER2 positive, but also estrogen receptor positive, which is about 60% of HER2 positive cancers. And those patients, when they're in their maintenance phase, not only get the trastuzumab and pertuzumab, they also typically get an anti-estrogen drug like letrozole or fulvestrant. What they did in this trial was they took those patients who were getting the antibodies, trastuzumab, pertuzumab, and an anti-estrogen drug, and they randomized them such that half the patients also got another class of pill, oral drug, called a CDK4/6 inhibitor, in this case, a drug called palbociclib, also known as Ibrance. And they found that by adding the palbociclib to those patients who were getting endocrine therapy and the HER2 antibodies, that also resulted in very good and durable control of the cancer, such that the patients who were getting the palbociclib had on average their disease controlled for 44 months, really incredibly long periods of disease control, again, well over 3 years.
While the trials that Dr. Kropp discussed are investigating ways to treat newly diagnosed HER2-positive metastatic breast cancer, the EmpowHER 303 trial is studying a new treatment option for patients who have progressed on or are not tolerant to trastuzumab deruxtecan, or TDXD. This trial is testing if a drug called zanidatamab, used in combination with chemotherapy, can provide better outcomes than trastuzumab used in combination with chemotherapy. Komen scholar Dr. Sarah Tolaney discussed this trial in more detail.
For patients who have metastatic HER2-positive disease, our goal is obviously to try to provide them with the most efficacious therapy possible. And once patients have progressed on prior TDXD, usually our treatment choices really are choosing a chemo drug and giving it with trastuzumab. The EmpowHER 303 study is a randomized phase 3 trial for patients who previously received TDXD, and they get randomized to get chemo plus zanidatamab, so it's chemo of physician's choice, or to get chemo plus trastuzumab. The study does require that patients have received at least 2 lines of HER2-directed therapy in the metastatic setting and no more than 4 prior lines of treatment for metastatic disease. Prior tucatinib is not required, but prior TDXD is required for study eligibility. And the study is really looking to see when zanidatamab is combined with chemotherapy, does it do better than chemotherapy with trastuzumab? Patients are followed until time of progression, as well as they'll be followed for overall survival, but the primary endpoint is progression-free survival. This is a drug that binds to 2 different places on HER2, and it results in clustering of the HER2 receptor. So it's really inhibiting HER2 signaling. We also think that it may also be enhancing ADCC, so causing immune-related cell death as well, because it isn't just binding to one spot on HER2, because it's able to bind to 2 different areas. The idea here is, again, we are probably seeing more enhanced inhibition of HER2 signaling. And so for patients, I think this offers the potential to get a HER2-directed agent that may be more effective than our standard treatment option, which would be chemo plus trastuzumab, but rather to give you chemo plus zanidatamab, thinking that we're maybe, again, better able to shut down that HER2 signaling, maybe better able to kill tumor cells and result in longer control of cancer.
We'll keep you updated on the results from the EmpowHER 303 trial when we learn more. Dr. Tolaney ended by providing some encouragement and advice to patients who are living with metastatic HER2-positive breast cancer.
For someone who has metastatic HER2-positive disease, thankfully, we have so many highly effective treatments that can be given sequentially over someone's lifetime. But I think the one thing that I'm also super excited about is that there keep being new drugs that come out. And so usually during the course of someone's cancer journey, multiple new agents often come into clinical trials and even get approvals. And so the number of options continually increases. So what I tell someone when they're first diagnosed, for example, with metastatic HER2 positive disease in terms of what their treatment options are, is often very different than what I tell them a few years later at a different point in time in their cancer journey, where different drugs are now all of a sudden available or different trials are available. And I will say, as an oncologist, that is, I think, the thing that drives us the most is we love being able to give new and better options to our patients. And the fact that more and more keep coming that seem to be just so highly effective, I think gives us a lot of hope and a lot of encouragement. So always make sure you're talking to your oncologist about clinical trial options, because there are just so many drugs you can get access to that are very effective agents and important to consider during your treatment journey.
Finally, we spoke with Susan Cagle, a patient advocate with a family history of breast cancer. She shared her unique perspective on the progress that we've made and the work that is still ahead of us.
In terms of HER2 positive breast cancer itself, it's research at its finest, where here you have a really aggressive cancer, but by working to really understand what's driving it, in this case, HER2 itself, they've been able to develop so many good targeted therapies that, really can change and have changed outcomes. But the work is still ongoing. So, one of the important questions is not just, what treatment, but when, because as we have more opportunities and more drugs available, it's not just if they work, but when should you even give them? I think in terms of metastatic breast cancer, right now it is not a curable disease, and that has to change, and not just for a few, but really for everyone. The reason that cancer is so successful is it develops mechanisms of resistance around all these treatments. And it's kind of this like relentless demon in that way. And so the more we study resistance and try and get at it before that resistance develops, right? So that, or, to be able to attack it from multiple angles at once, so that it can no longer progress. And we might have the option of having a disease that can be cured. In addition, patients again are on treatment for indefinitely, and toxicity and side effects are real, right? And they have an impact on these patients and their lives. Even if you move on to a different treatment, some of those side effects can stay with you for a really long time, if not indefinitely. And so I think the more work that's done on decreasing side effects and improving quality of life, and also allowing patients to stay on a given line of therapy longer, will just really have a positive impact on people living with the disease. I'm really inspired just by the abundance of research taking place in terms of, developing better therapies, more targeted therapies, resulting in more options for patients, tailoring therapy to make sure it's really the best match, not only for the patient, but for their specific breast cancer. I think all that work is so important. Honestly, what I find most inspiring about the research is really the people themselves that just keep moving forward in this work despite its complexity. We want there to be one pill, one treatment that works for everyone and can make cancer disappear or never occur. But the reality is it doesn't work that way. But the researchers, the clinicians, and the staff keep pushing forward. And to me, that's incredibly inspiring. I always wonder about my grandmother who died in her 20s from breast cancer. And I think if she was diagnosed today, what would her experience be? And then, how that would have changed her outcomes, but also how that would have affected everyone else's story that's connected to her. And I think research is what's really made that, these changes possible.
Thank you for watching. We hope you now have a better understanding on what's new for metastatic HER2 positive breast cancer. Don't forget to sign up for reminders for breast cancer breakthroughs. We've linked the homepage below. Be sure to like and subscribe to this channel to catch more episodes. And finally, if you enjoyed today's episode, please take 2 minutes to fill out our short survey, which is linked below.